something that's, kind of bitchy.
Bitty to cheek.
Bitchy?
I know. It was just, bitchy.
Well, first of all, you're a little bitchy. That's next level bitchy.
Welcome to Bitchy History, where we cut through the myths and nostalgia to get to the raw, unvarnished truth about the past. With sharp analysis, a feminist lens, and just the right amount of bitchiness, we're here to show you that history isn't just something to study, it's something to question. Let's get started. Do you remember those early days of the pandemics? The sourdough, the spreadsheets, the childcare acrobatics, and how many women were responsible for holding it all together? I kept thinking, we've seen this movie before. In the 14th century, a different plague hit, and women did what they always do. They kept people alive and the economy running. They ran the workshops, trained the apprentices, harvested the fields. And then when life stabilized, the system said, thanks, could you get back to your old way of doing things? Today's episode is my love letter, and a tiny bit of rage mail to those women. It's a story about the visibility that shows up in the most boring of places: taxes, guild rolls, and court fines. Let's dive in. The year is 1348. The streets smell like incense and death, and half your neighborhood has the plague. Priests are dying faster than they can give people last rites, and in the middle of all of this cataclysm, something even more shocking starts happening. Women are getting job offers, because nothing says gender equality like the end of the world. Today on Bitchy History, we're talking about the way the Black Death cracked open Europe's rigid social order, briefly, and made space for women to do work that medieval men had insisted could only be done by, men for a very long time. In 3 very messy years, up to 40% of Europe's population died. That's about 25 million people. The old system collapsed, and necessity did what sermons and statutes never could. It put women in charge of businesses, workshops, and fields. But spoiler alert, this is obviously not a victory lap. This was a brief window of opportunity, and that window starts closing as soon as the men can reappear to slam it shut. Think of it as the medieval version of "We Can Do It" posters, only with more fleas and fewer rights at the end. Before we watch patriarchy temporarily lose its grip, then come roaring back, let's rewind to what normal looked like. If you've been picturing the medieval housewife as someone indoors gazing out a narrow window while waiting for their man to come home from the wars, no. Women made up a significant portion of the medieval labor force at this point. It's just that much of it was labeled household work, which is medieval for the entire supply chain. Here's the short list of a confined-to-the-home woman's job: child rearing, gardening, processing and preserving food, baking and cooking, spinning and weaving, and often full clothing manufacturing, foraging and tending small stock like chickens, pigs, and goats. That is production. Repeat, production. It kept families and villages alive. And there wasn't some impenetrable wall between men's tasks and women's tasks. Male and female roles overlapped very often. Everyone harvested when it was time. Women herded and helped with plowing and sowing. Men could and did card or shear wool when needed. By the 13th century, Europe's population had boomed and land was growing scarce. You couldn't keep a family afloat on subsistence plots alone, so women's work outside the home expanded. They sold butter, cheese, soap, and cloth at local markets. The commercialized economy was run by women in many cases. They also entered a growing service economy: wet nurses, cleaners, cooks, laundresses, domestic servants, jobs that proliferated in towns where wealthier households could outsource all that hard stuff to somebody else. So when people say that women entered the economy after the Black Death, you can kindly correct them. Women were already in it. They had always been in it. The plague didn't invent women's work. It just forced the recognition of it. Then rats get busy. Between 1347 and 1351, the plague rolls through Europe in waves. Monasteries empty out, parish priests die by the dozens, and entire hamlets cease to exist. Simultaneously, the Hundred-Year War keeps eating men at the edges of Europe's map. It's an all-systems failure. But labor shortages do funny things to hierarchy. They flatten it. With half the workforce in plague pits and battlefields, landlords, town councils, and guilds had a choice: let women do the work, or let the economy die. Shockingly, they chose taxes, which meant choosing women. Wages went up where they could, bargaining power rose from the grave like a very tired zombie. Suddenly the question, can women do men's work, gets answered with, they already are. Fields have to be sown, sheep don't spin themselves, and barrels don't walk themselves into taverns. Women stepped into agriculture at scale, planting, harvesting, managing hires, because someone had to do it. They also moved visibly into the urban trades, brewing, textiles, innkeeping, market vending, and yes, even craft workshops that had once been treated as purely male spaces. And crucially, death doesn't only change who does the work, it changes who owns the work. The plague didn't just remove husbands, it scrambled inheritance lines. With sons and brothers dead, women, especially widows, inherited property, workshops, and stock at higher rates. They became, in the language of the records, femme sole for legal purposes, able to contract, sue, and be sued. In English villages like Thornbury, court rolls show widows running farms, hiring labor, and even declining to remarry because they didn't need to. In London, city authorities went beyond merely allowing this, they were incentivizing it. City officials wanted widows of merchants and craftsmen to keep the workshops going because idle shops meant lost customs, lost levies, and lost civic prosperity. In some cases, widows were required to train their late husband's apprentices or make proper provision for them, precisely so the production chain and tax base wouldn't collapse. This isn't modern enlightenment, it's emergency pragmatism, let's be real. But it had very real consequences. Women running shops, signing accounts, and negotiating contracts in public. If the medieval city is looked at like a stage, widows just got speaking roles. Guilds, those gatekeeping fraternities that regulated quality, training, and prices of goods, are not usually friends to female autonomy. But after the plague, necessity pried open a side door. In England's Brewers' Company, women were not a curiosity, they're a constituency. The Guild's records show women admitted as members, and by 1419, 39 of them are on the rolls. Why brewing? Because ale, a daily staple, was historically a female craft. As markets expanded, it scaled from kitchen to workshop, and women scaled with it. Textiles tell a similar story. In the Low Countries and northern Italy, women anchored whole segments of the cloth trades, spinning, winding, fulling, finishing, and in some places the silk industry itself. Women cultivated silkworms, reeled filament, spun and wove, and often in female dense production chains that rested on matrilineal skill networks, mothers training daughters, and so on. In Florence and Lucca, you could find women in the ledgers, paid, contracted, and indispensable. Family workshops also matter. The master might be the husband on paper, but the wife manages production, keeps accounts, and sells stock. Some guilds even quietly valued a wife's labor enough to give masters with no wife permission for an extra apprentice, the tacit admission that a wife was, in effect, a trained shop hand. Point is, after the plague, women were visible in places they'd been present but invisible before. They ran things, they trained people, their names appeared. Another side effect of depopulation, fewer people are marrying. With more women holding property and income streams, the average age at first marriage ticks up in many locales. Women delay or decline marriage when they can survive without it. That doesn't mean a feminist utopia, it just means they have leverage. A woman with a loom, a yard, and a small herd is not cornered into a bad match. A widow with a going concern isn't racing to find a new male manager for her life. Sounds familiar. And that autonomy, partial, pragmatic, and conditional though it was, matters. It shows up in the contracts, in the market fines, and in apprentice disputes. When you can track women in the prosaic paperwork of daily life, you are seeing real power, even when no one calls it by that name. You will sometimes hear historians refer to a golden age for European women after the Black Death. And sure, relative to 1320, things look golden. But we need to be careful. Two things can be true at once. One, women gained visibility, income, and legal standing in specific contexts, especially as widows, producers, and small traders. Two, women were still paid less than men for the same tasks, their access to guild credentials was fragile, and much of their authority was explicitly temporary, an emergency measure to keep the tax base intact. Judith Bennett's work on brewing is the cautionary tale. Women build an industry, then lose it as technology, capital, and regulation shift, from small batch ale to large-scale hopped beer, from household to commercial brewery. Sandy Bardsley warns against imagining a wholesale revolution. Women's status improves in places for years under pressure, and then plateaus or reverses. Let's be blunt. What changed was visibility and leverage. Women stepped into roles that men and institutions had long insisted were male and proved, again, that competence is not chromosomal. They ran workshops, signed bills, sold at the market, managed the farms, trained apprentices, and kept entire towns solvent. What didn't change was the default setting, patriarchy. The social machine still assumed men should own, lead, and speak. Women's participation was welcomed as long as it solved a crisis and framed as abnormal the moment it didn't. Which brings us to the next part of the story, because as populations recovered in the later 15th century, the system started rolling back the welcome mat. So let's fast forward. It's been a few decades since plague first tore through Europe. Babies are being born again, markets are recovering, wheat waves in the fields, and across the continent, a certain familiar voice clears its throat and says, "All right, ladies, fun's over, get back in the house." Welcome to the late 14th and 15th centuries when men regroup, guilds lawyer up, and cities decide that women's emergency heroics needed to go back to being invisible. Let's start with labor law. In the first shock after 1348, wages rose and workers negotiated because half the workforce was gone. That will not do. England moved quickly with the Ordinance of Laborers in 1349 and the Statute of Laborers in 1351 to cap wages at pre-plague levels and punish people who left service for better pay. It didn't mention women by name, but it undercut the very leverage women had begun to exercise as day laborers, harvesters, brewers, spinners, and servants. Here's the practical math. If you're a widow running a shop and paying 2 hired hands, capped wages might look like protection, until you realize that price controls and mobility bans also let powerful lords and big masters keep labor cheap and workers tied down. If you're a female servant who's finally bargained a higher rate because literally no one else will do the laundry of the living, you're now committing a crime if you demand that wage. The law pretended to restore order, but it actually restored elite control. As the century wore on, vagrancy statutes and master-servant ordinances tightened the screws. Towns cracked down on masterless people, a phrase that reads one way in a plague pit and another way in a magistrate's minute book. If you're a woman without a man's cover, husband, father, master, you're suddenly a problem to be policed. That is the ideological pivot. The independent woman transforms in paperwork into a risk. Now the main event, guilds. The doors that the plague crisis cracked open are about to slam shut once more. In the 1300s, alewives, women who brewed small batch ale, were everywhere. Their names fill manorial courts and city accounts because ale was a daily staple. After the plague, ale scaled up, money pooled, hopped beer, more capital-intensive, longer keeping, moved in from the Low Countries. Regulations and banking favored people who could command space, storage, and cash. Guess who guild politics privileged? Not the widow with the backyard mash tun. By the early 1400s, you can watch the linguistic shift. Brewster, woman brewer, fades from the records. Male brewers dominate wardenships and licensing. In London, guild roles that once admitted women as members or widows in right of their husbands began reading like men-only clubs, with women relegated to being assistants or pushed out entirely. Same story in other cities. As brewing becomes profitable, capitalized, and regulated, women are regulated away. Textiles remains mixed, but many crafts harden into masculine monopolies by the late 15th century. Butchery, tanning, metalwork, carpentry, guild ordinances evolve from practical rules to eligibility fences. Women cannot bind apprentices, cannot present masterpieces, cannot sue in guild courts without a male representative. In some places, even widows' rights, briefly expanded during the crisis, are narrowed to a short grace period to allow women to liquidate stock or finish existing contracts. London's blacksmiths' company is often cited to show the exception that proves the rule. In a 1430s charter, you might spot 2 sistren listed among the dozens of brethren, memorable precisely because it was unusual, and even then it didn't open the floodgates. The default reasserts itself. Membership is male. Women's labor is familial, auxiliary, and invisible. The family workshop persists. The wife keeps accounts, oversees production, and sells, but the credit migrates to the husband's guild identity. The work stays, the status leaves. The plague may have scrambled inheritance lines, but the recovery unscrambled it, for men. In mid-century, with heirs dead, widows and daughters inherited land and tools at a higher rate and ran them. As population stabilized and male kin multiplied again, custom and court leaned towards male preference succession. If a man died, the estate should return to the male line. If a widow wanted to keep running things, she would have to remarry and hand authority to her new husband. We should distinguish dower, a widow's life interest in a fraction of her husband's property, from dowry, property she brought into the marriage. Either way, the administration of estates gets nudged back towards male guardians. Cities that had compelled widows after 1348 to keep apprentices and workshops afloat now assign male tutors or supervisors, ostensibly to ensure quality in contracts, but conveniently to also re-embed the business into the male civic body. Once again, paperwork tells the story. Where we once saw widows suing and being sued in their own names, we begin seeing male names step back in. Where daughters had negotiated sales, guardians now consent on their behalf. None of this erased every businesswoman. There are stubborn, brilliant exceptions, but the trend line points toward the patriarchy reasserting full control. When women's economic independence becomes inconvenient, you don't just change guild bylaws, you change the terms of acceptable behavior. Enter the common scold. In late medieval English towns, being a scold, a woman who quarrels, shouts, or otherwise disturbs the peace with her tongue, becomes a chargeable offense. Courts punish with fines, public penance, or the ducking stool. The point isn't just civility, it's silencing. If you can redefine female speech as a nuisance or a crime, you can discipline the women who are running markets, negotiating contracts, or, God forbid, calling out corruption. This policing shows up elsewhere as well. Sumptuary laws fret about women dressing above their station. Moral regulation harasses women taverners and ale sellers, nominally about measure and quality, but functionally about containing female public presence. Even the hue and cry, that communal alarm that obligated neighbors to respond to crime, gains a gendered double standard. Women's alarms could be discounted or turned into charges of false clamor. When the voice goes, leverage goes with it. A woman who cannot speak without risking sanction is a woman who cannot bargain. By the late 15th century, the intellectual climate gets colder. Clerical writers and moralists intensify familiar motifs: female inconstancy, greed, lust, talkativeness, the usual bingo card. Then in 1486, two Dominican inquisitors published the Malleus Maleficarum, the manual that reads like a permit for all of Europe's worst instincts. It insists that women are especially prone to witchcraft because of their weaker faith and stronger carnal appetite. Delightful. While the great witch hunts escalate a bit later and unevenly, the logic is already useful in the 1400s. Women acting outside male oversight are suspect. Midwives, healers, tavern keepers, widows with means. Economically independent women become seen as moral threats. It's not that London wardens read the Malleus Maleficarum and run to shut women out of brewing. It's that the same patriarchal nervous system about women's bodies, voices, and money fired across law, theology, and commerce all at the same time. If you stopped here, you might think that everything rolled back to 1320. It didn't. Not everywhere, not all at once. Women continue to show up in textile accounts across the Low Countries and Italy. In London, certain niches like silk finishing, needlework, haberdashery retain women's fingerprints. Some widows keep trading under their own seals for years, especially if they have adult children who are invested in the business. Even in brewing, women didn't vanish, they shrank. From free men to unrecorded labor, from wardens to wives and helpers. The expulsion from formal status doesn't magically remove skill. It removes credit, political power, and pathways for the next generation. But the know-how circulates, in kitchens and courts all the same. And memory lingers. Communities remember who kept the ovens lit when the world went dark. Families remember who paid the rent the year the harvest failed. Memory isn't law, but it is narrative fuel, and narratives have a way of reigniting when conditions shift again. This would all be a quaint medieval morality tale if it wasn't so repetitive. World War II. Women enter heavy industry, engineering codes, and farms, then are demobilized to make room for returning soldiers. The COVID-19 pandemic. Women disproportionately were represented in essential work and unpaid care, then were disproportionately pushed out when the crisis was over. The script is old and it repeats over and over again. Crisis leads to women's labor becoming essential and visible, which leads to recovery, which leads to remasculinization of wages, status, and narrative. If you're hearing the refrain, temporary emergency, not permanent rights, you're getting the point. Underneath the legalese and sermons, two anxieties sit like bookends. 1. Control of production and pay. If women can run workshops, bind apprentices, and sign contracts, then authority in towns is now not inherently male. That threatens the entire system that European patriarchy was based upon. 2. Control of lineage and legitimacy. If women can hold land and delay or decline marriage, men cannot as easily route property through male lines. That threatens inheritance strategies that knit the elites together. Call it patriarchy, call it the house system. It's a structure that converts women's competence into male credit whenever possible and declares that conversion to be the natural state. So where do we land? The Black Death gave women responsibility on a public stage, shops, fields, guilds, courts, because there was no other choice. As soon as choice returned, systems were rebuilt to recenter men. Wage caps to mute bargaining, guild fences to block credentials, inheritance maneuvers to reattach property to the male lines, moral policing to discipline women who didn't get the hint. By 1500, the face of urban economic power is once again male. But here's why this story matters, even if it didn't end in revolution. The plague years proved capacity in the most undeniable currency of pre-modern life: account books and court rolls. Not ideals, not epigrams, entries. Women trained apprentices. Women ran ledgers. Women paid taxes. You cannot unprove competence. You can hide it, you can relabel it, but somewhere the receipts will remain. And if we're honest, that's the emotional core of this episode. The Golden Age wasn't a utopia, it was a glimpse of what a society looks like when women aren't prevented from doing what they can do. The backlash tells us less about women's limits than about how far institutions will go to ensure those limits are enforced. Next time on Bitchy History, we pivot from the ledger to the legend. Joan of Arc. Teenage commander, holy icon, cross-dressing cultural problem, and Exhibit A in how medieval Europe loved an exceptional woman as a symbol while denying ordinary women the system. We'll pull the thread from the battlefield to the bonfire and ask why a woman in armor thrilled a kingdom but still got burned at the stake, and how her legend has been used and abused ever since. That's it for this episode of Bitchy History. If you enjoyed the show, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe, review, and share it with someone who loves history as much as we do. Until next time, stay curious and keep questioning the world around you.
History. 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 History.
History.
What a bitch, right?